You are listening to the Speech Space Podcast, a podcast full of tips and resources for SLPs.
I'm your host, Jessica Cassidy,
and this is episode 56. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. I know that I often talk about how to use technology in your speech room, but today we're going to flip that and we're actually going to be talking about the ways we should not be using technology in the speech room. Before I get started, I wanted to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by the Digital SLP membership site, which is a site that features time-saving, no-print, and low-prep resources for SLPs. To learn more about the membership, head on over to thespeechspace.com/digital SLP. The membership is currently closed, but you can jump on the waitlist by heading over to thedigitalslp.com and clicking on Join the Waitlist, or you can also text DSLP WAIT to 844-723-3364. Okay, so like I mentioned in the introduction, it is a little unusual for me to talk about how not to use technology because I'm usually always talking about how to use it, but that's what we're going to cover today. So one way I would say not to use it is to not use it with your younger students. I would say kindergarten and under, unless you really have to. You know, these guys need to be playing and having lots of hands-on experiences, and they get enough exposure to technology, and there's just too many fun and simple ways to make speech therapy engaging for them without using an iPad or computer or smartboard or some sort of device. The exception here, of course, is if you do teletherapy or if you have a student that is only motivated by the iPad or something along those lines. But for teletherapy, of course, you're doing most of your session. Well, you're doing all of your session through the computer. And so most of it is going to be, where you're interacting with either some sort of application or some sort of online digital resource. So you can't really avoid it there. And I would say for that, the benefits of using the digital resources outweigh the risks of using it with younger children, because those are children who, if teletherapy didn't exist, they might not be served at all. So, okay. Let's move along. I would say my next thing that I'd like to say that you should not be doing is setting your students up with an iPad and walking away. Now, I would assume that most therapists are not doing this, but I did feel the need to talk about it. Setting your student up with an activity and walking away, it's not skilled. So they don't need a skilled speech therapist to do that, and we're there to provide skilled services. So it's very important that we're not doing that. Now, of course, if once a month you're taking data, sitting next to your student and not interacting as much as usual for a couple of minutes, that's no problem. But this just isn't something that you would want to do often. You wouldn't want to be doing this every session, and you wouldn't want to make a habit of this. And I will get into that a little bit more about the interaction piece in some of my next bullet points that I'm going to talk about. The other problem that can come up when using technology or iPads is when you're not discussing what you're doing on the iPad or computer or smartboard. Sometimes I'm just going to say iPad, but please just know that I mean any sort of technology, that you're not discussing what you're doing on the iPad or using it in an interactive way where joint attention is being established. It can actually hinder communication skills instead of facilitate them whenever you do that. This kind of goes back to what I mentioned before about not just setting your student up and walking away. You want to make sure that it's a back and forth between you, the student, and the device. The other thing you should not do is to make the tablet the only thing that you use in your speech therapy sessions. So, I'm a big fan of using digital resources, and I have the Digital SLP online membership, but I would never suggest having that be 100% of your session. It's a great resource to use to help you save time, but I would never suggest being 100% digital. Unless you had to be. Again, I feel like teletherapy is the exception to the rule for all of these bullet points here. But, you would never want it to be 100% of how you're doing your therapy. The students, honestly, they get bored of the same thing over and over, and too much tech is not necessarily a good thing. So you want to mix your sessions up to include things like movement, music, discussion about books, art projects, sensory experiences, And, technology, it's a good thing. It is. It can be if it's used wisely. You just don't want it to be 100% of your sessions. It's a balancing act, and this is how students will thrive the most whenever you balance things out and use a lot of different approaches. Now, of course, again, like I said, in teletherapy, you have to be much more tech-based in your sessions than you do in a regular speech therapy room. So you also want to keep this in mind and not feel guilty if you're doing teletherapy. You're doing the right thing there, and there's always an exception to the rule. So the next thing is to not pass an app or a no print along to a parent and say, hey, use this with your child at home without giving the parent some training. So they might not understand that it's crucial to be a participant in the activity instead of walking away and letting the child navigate the activity solo. They might not understand that their child needs help not only navigating through the resource, but they need verbal feedback, or they might need some sort of cueing. So you really want to let the parent know exactly how they should be using that resource with the child. And the last point that I want to touch on is to educate your parents about the benefits of avoiding technology for promoting social skills. We've seen what the effects of smartphones have done to social skills, even for neurotypical adults. I mean, how many times have you used your phone to avoid a conversation with someone or to avoid small talk in an elevator? I'm sure everyone listening has done that to some degree. Schools are incorporating more and more technology, and it's just really important to let parents know that there is such a thing as too much screen time, too much technology time. And now this goes for all kids, but especially those who are working on social skills. Now, according to a Stanford study, girls ages 8 through 12 who spend a lot of time consuming media and attempting to multitask reported lower self-esteem and more difficulty socializing than their less media-driven peers. And the author of this study, Clifford Nass, he said that the antidote for this is for children to spend more time interacting with others face-to-face and thereby learning crucial skills in emotional recognition. And I don't think that any SLP listening to that and to, learning about that study would be the least bit surprised that, we need to be teaching our students to lean into and notice these different emotional reactions and facial expressions. That's how they're going to learn. So when you do use technology with these students, I highly suggest having control of the iPad, meaning that you're the one using it. You're almost setting it up like a lesson in front of them. You're not necessarily passing it around and letting them navigate through. You're using it as more of a discussion piece instead of something where they're clicking and scrolling, and especially with apps, with all the bells and whistles and apps. I do prefer to use the no prints instead of apps with some of these social skills groups and social skills students that I would see, just because I think that less is more. And for these students, that's definitely the case a lot of the time. So, maybe you set it up and you have some pictures that you're going to scroll through that you're going to hold up in front of the group, and you would do the scrolling, and it's a discussion piece. So you're essentially just replacing, whatever you'd be using, like maybe flashcards or something like that. You're just showing it on your device instead of using that hard product. So you can still get a really great lesson out of it, but you're just using it in a different way than you normally would, where you might, for some of your other groups, be, letting the students have a little bit more control of the iPad. So I hope that some of those tips were helpful. I could honestly go on a bit longer about that, but we're going to wrap it up there for today. Maybe I'll do a part 2 later. I hope that you learned something, and I would love to know your thoughts on using technology in the speech room. As always, if you like what you heard, please take a moment to give a 5-star review on iTunes to help your fellow SLPs find the show. And to access the show notes from today's episode, you can just go to bit.ly/TSSEP56. So again, that's bit.ly/TSSEP56. If you would like to learn more about the Digital SLP membership, head on over to thedigitalslp.com. Like I mentioned, the doors just closed back up, but if you sign up for the waitlist, you'll be the first to know when they open again. All right, everyone, that is it for me for today. I thank you so much for tuning in, and have a lovely week.